Peter Aling'o, what is your assessment of how Kenya has done in the fight against terror in the last year, since the Westgate attack?
Kenya has not done very well, in my view, in the fight against terror. I think the response that Kenya has adopted since the last year's Westgate attack has been a response that has been more or less bullish in character, that entails display of raw military power and raw military brutal police approach to the problem of terrorism, without necessarily looking into the root causes of terrorism and dealing with it from a holistic perspective that can then engage citizens of the country and those who are living in Kenya as well. I believe that yes, some short-term progress has been made in terms of dispersing the core of the threat in terms of where it is perceived to reside. For example, in the Eastleigh area of Nairobi, Operation Usalama Watch made some progress in the short term in terms of dispersing the interests that converge to generate the threat of terrorism and also the activities. But that has not gone into the critical core causes of what makes Kenya vulnerable to terrorist attacks. And I see that also happening in the coastal area of Kenya, where we have seen, for example, militarization of the entire coastal region, and also an approach that is more or less brutal, which is involving the anti-terrorist police unit. And that is a concern for us, because it is not just making Kenya, engage in a holistic manner with the problem and the threat of terrorism, but radicalizing Kenyans even more, alienating Kenyans even more, and excluding Kenyans from finding a sustainable and long-lasting solution to the problem. I think the problem Kenya has now metamorphosed into something else, which is completely different from the original threat that was coming from Somalia in the nature of al-shabaab. We are now seeing a sense in which homegrown terrorism is becoming the greater threat that Kenya has to deal with. And this, for me, is a threat that requires that Kenya has to think, go back to the drawing board, to reflect over the issue in terms of what are the drivers of this. So since the Westgate last year, you've seen quite an increase in the number of terrorist attacks. We have not seen a replica of the Westgate in the nature and style that it happened, but we have seen an increase in sporadic attacks happening not just in Nairobi or Mombasa, but also in the northern part of Kenya. And that is what is worrying, because it is involving Kenyan youth and Kenyan nationals.
Why do you think that Kenyan youth are more vulnerable to radicalization now?
The Kenyan youth are more vulnerable to radicalization for a number of reasons. One is that the Kenyan youth of today, they feel much more marginalized by the government than before. There is quite a great deal of unemployment that we see. There's a lot of poverty and frustration. There's also a lot of corruption in terms of access to resources, including employment. And this adding to the problem of runaway insecurity in the country then creates an environment that makes the youth look towards alternative means of eking out a living and also making meaning out of their frustrated life.
So it's very easy at that point for a young Muslim person to say, it's because I'm Muslim that I'm not getting a job, or that I feel marginalized by the government.
Both of those. The fact that, they are Muslims, and by virtue of being a Muslim, finding yourself marginalized, finding yourself always at the end or tail of things in terms of, one, being able to identify with the government of the day, and the deliberate government policy that discriminates against Muslims in terms of access to resources and also in terms of access to the tools that enable the youth to climb the ladder towards employment, like acquisition of national identity cards, for example. So this, adding to the fact that there is widespread vulnerability and corruption that frustrates the youth, makes the Kenyan Muslim youth even more vulnerable, because then they have a sense in which they see themselves as having lost the Kenyan identity, and therefore have to look to something else to find that identity.
So the political elite in Nairobi really needs to reach out to Kenyan Muslims in particular across the country and make them feel a greater part of Kenyan society.
Completely. I think the bigger picture, if we look at it in terms of solutions, lies in how best the Kenyan government and the political elite are able to dialogue with the Kenyan youth, the Kenyan Muslim community, in order to create a platform where, they can have a sense of belonging and a sense of identity, and a sense in which they can proudly call themselves, identify themselves as Kenyans, a sense in which they don't feel isolated and driven to the extreme. That, for me, is the bigger question, and indeed the answer to the problem. We must be able, as Kenyans, look at the differences that we have and the vulnerabilities that are created out of the differences. One, the political differences. Two, the economic and social, cultural differences. And most importantly, the identity problem that we see emerging, particularly out of the youth. We must be able to check on this. If we don't, then this is a population that is completely growing, and it is a time bomb that, if not checked, will burst.
Do you fear more Westgates then, if this time bomb does explode?
Not really more Westgates, but my fear is that we will see continuous activities happening in Nairobi, in Mombasa, and in northern part of Kenya, and almost everywhere, because the threat knows no boundaries. I think the country as a whole is under threat.
What about those who would say this is a dirty war, we're fighting terror here? If some of the methods we use in fighting back are a little bit dirty in themselves, it's justified in order to protect the Kenyan people.
I don't think that that in itself, generates cleanliness. That, for me, is the wrong way, that we see this as a dirty war, and therefore a dirty game, and therefore employ dirty tactics. Dirty tactics only help to harden individuals and make them even more isolated and radicalized. And that is the real fact. You act dirty, your opponent becomes even more dirtier, by the day. So at the end of the day, you are not generating any solution, but poisoning the environment even further. That is what it is. You don't want the environment to be poisoned further. It's already poisoned. The idea here is to think through and reflect on how to dilute the environment. But in diluting this environment, you need to work with the people, including those whose minds are already poisoned. How do you manage to get them to think through this as well and help you find solutions as Kenyans? I think it can be done. It needs to be done. It doesn't need to be dirty. It doesn't need to be brutal the way the anti-terror police unit is doing it. No. You don't have to abuse human rights in order to solve a problem. Work with people and create an environment where people can feel that their wholesomeness as individuals is respected and valued. Then they are part of the solution.
Do you think that there is any introspection happening within the Kenyan government? I haven't seen the Kenyan government speaking out this week so far anyway about the terrorism problem that it faces in Kenya. There seems to be quite a lot of silence on the issue from government itself. But do you think within government that introspection is happening?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the government mindset is that this is a dirty war and that it has to be fought in a dirty way. And the Kenyan government also has this perspective that this is a security matter and therefore it's not a matter that needs to be brought out to the public domain. I think not. I think this is a public issue. It's a matter of public interest. It affects the entire population living in Kenya, whether Kenyans or non-Kenyans. And therefore it's an issue that needs to be discussed openly, debated openly. There needs to be dialogue over this so that ownership over solutions to the problems can happen. I think it's only when Kenyans own solutions and be able to identify with solutions that they can sustain those solutions.